Hello, welcome to Season 11 of The Horrific Podcast. We're two friends who live in different places but share a love for scary movies. This season, in each episode, we will not both watch the same movie on our own and then record a conversation together about it later. We have 10 previous seasons of doing exactly that, and it's time for something new. This season, each episode will focus on a larger horror topic, trend, or maybe even rumor. We'll speculate about upcoming movies, debate genre definitions, and do our best to apply the perspective of two people who have watched way too many horror movies to different types of horror media. Thanks for coming along for the ride. So, had you heard of Oats Studios? Is that something you're familiar with?
I believe I had heard from it from you, but I didn't do much research into it until after you clarified when we were talking about this week's episode.
Gotcha, yeah. So, a guy that I used to play in a band with named Zach actually had recommended this to me when I said that I liked horror movies and that we did a podcast. And I started watching some of the videos at the time, but that had to have been super, super early on, because I think Oats has only been around since 2017, and that would have been around the time that I would have talked to him about it, like maybe early 2018. So there is definitely a lot more content now than there was at that time. But I also, where I kind of got the idea for this week's episode was that I noticed they had added some of the videos to Netflix, which makes it much easier to just put on and kind of make your way through than having to go like YouTube video to YouTube video.
Yeah, and I think also the difference between like YouTube and Netflix is like YouTube is definitely getting pretty censored, and which makes content creators that have, say, cuss words or, you know, they have guns and that's what they're about or whatever, like you have to have paid sponsors for it. So I would definitely, I mean, I'm not saying that Netflix is any better, but it definitely has to be better than that. Maybe almost like a signed contract better situation, but yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, because definitely then I could see where this would be a better fit for any platform that is less restrictive on content.
Right.
Because this one got pretty gnarly a few times.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But anyway, I guess the kind of larger story on this is Oats Studios started as a film studio that primarily made shorts for YouTube. And I had read that it was with the intention initially of seeing like what played well or like what people responded to well, and then turning those into like larger productions. Mm-hmm. But I noticed going through that there's definitely a lot of more just like episodic content. So like things that are meant to be almost like a short sketch that they do a bunch of versions of too. And I don't think those are necessarily intended to turn into larger movies. So maybe they just enjoyed sort of that shorter format. Yeah.
And I think going to like, you know, we were talking about like trends on new, like where we think horror movies might be going, or people who make horror movies where they might be going. And I think this is like a very prime example of like a current situation. I know it was 2017, but like, you know, they got their start on YouTube and Steam. That's free, you know, that's free to sign up and start doing. Like you can, meaning like anyone can do this. I mean, you know, you gotta have the equipment to record and the ideas and all that, but still it's like, I felt like when we were growing up, like the thought of making a movie would have been just like insane to think like we'd ever have the opportunity to, but now we have the platforms like that you can use. So, I think it's a pretty cool. Now, granted, you know, it is by, an Oscar nominated a filmmaker that kind of started this, which I think helped it gain a little bit more, steam, but still, I mean, they use YouTube and Steam to gauge what the interests, and I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, definitely. And you're right in that is a really interesting thing of just taking the full power of distribution and making that a thing anybody has access to. So like you can put it on YouTube and then anybody can watch it. Whereas if you rewind 30 years, then how would you ever show anybody if you made it? And so then if you have a smaller audience, you have smaller ways of like making any sort of revenue to make it like a sustainable thing. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you can put it on YouTube and then use social media to advertise, then you have a much, much wider audience and a much larger number of people who might enjoy the content enough to like support you financially for it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of cool, adding that additional freedom or maybe lack of constraint on getting content directly to consumers. And I think that's one thing that we've kind of talked about in the past is when there aren't larger financial interests involved and a creative filmmaker is sort of just free to experiment, that's where some really interesting stuff comes from. And I think that we saw that in these videos.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, as far as what is on Netflix currently, I think there were 7 or 8, maybe. Some were sort of the, I guess, more prototype videos, like Raqqa, which sort of was the beginning of like a dystopian alien invasion story. And then it had like 3 parts. And then there was another one that was Firebase that was kind of the same. But then we had some things like Cooking with Bill or God or Bad President, which were more of like the kind of episodes where it's a short thing with sort of the recurring characters that have a little bit of a formula and do kind of the same thing each time. And so definitely not all of these were horror in the traditional sense. Mm-hmm. Like the Bad President one I don't think was, and I don't know that I would necessarily classify God as like typical horror, but I wanted to talk to you about Cooking with Bill.
Okay.
Because I think that was very much like disgust or body horror. But it was not, it was really interesting to me because it was so camped in like that kind of retro QVC channel, home shopping network type vibe. And from a filmmaking perspective, I really enjoyed the way that they added like almost like the tracking lines like you would have if you were watching an old school, VHS tape.
Yeah.
Like it was a really nostalgic feeling for me, but the content was just like wildly unnerving. And I was curious if you were as grossed out by it as I was.
Yeah. So when we, talked about doing Oats Studio.
Yeah.
And you re-explained it to me, I went off of YouTube.
Oh, okay.
And I went off of just the Serious Oats videos that they had.
Okay.
So that's Raqqa, Firebase, and Zygote.
Gotcha. So you didn't see some of the shorter ones? Like
no, I did watch Bad President, mm-hmm. But I didn't give it really the time of day as I gave those 3 there. But I'm definitely interested in hearing about it.
Yeah, so God was basically just like, God is an old man in a lounge jacket with a butler, and he had like this table where you could see like primitive humans, and then he would occasionally just tell his butler to do something terrible to them, and then he would just go like wreck their world, and God was just like mostly indifferent towards it. And so it was just kind of like set up for that, which was fine, I guess. But then the Bad President one was just like the president doing a press conference, and there's like hookers walking by behind him, and empty beer cans everywhere and stuff, and like then you find out like he's got his drug dealer friends that show up in the White House and all this stuff like that. So it was definitely more like kind of a black comedy, I would say, more than horror. But the one that was Cooking with Bill, it's basically just like he either mutilates himself or the device that he's selling makes something really disgusting that he then eats. And so one of them was like the Damasu 950, and it was supposed to be like an electric knife. And so of course he like ends up mutilating his own hand and arm. But then there was one that was the Magic Blend, and it's like supposed to be able to blend any type of food, but everything that comes out of it just has like long pieces of hair in it.
Oh, God.
And so he always like either eats or drinks it and then just has to pull like a long piece of black hair out of his mouth.
Yeah.
It's absolutely disgusting. It is complete just like gross out horror. But I really, that one was interesting to me from like a genre perspective, because I know that like body horror is a real thing, but there's also that kind of just like gross out, make you uncomfortable, like disturbing images subgenre of horror, and that's definitely what this fit into.
Yeah.
Which was weird because it was also presented as such like a lighthearted like Home Shopping Network type video.
I actually really like that idea. I think that's great. It kind of reminds me of like, just from what you're describing, like a serious, more, I don't want to say serious, but I'm going to say it for lack of better words, version of like a episode of Steve Burrell, where he does like a home network shopping. And yeah.
Yep.
Anyway, sounds good.
Yeah. So that was him. But anyway, so those were kind of the one-offs, I guess.
Yeah.
Where you had like a bunch of like shorter episodes. And looking back at our horror subgenres list, gore and disturbing was one on the one that we've kind of been working from. Mm-hmm. And it had torture, splatter, cannibal, and extreme. And I think extreme would be where you would have to put maybe the Magiblend 200.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to check those out.
Yeah.
I was actually really impressed, though, with the three that with two of the three that I watched.
Yeah, so which ones did you end up watching?
So,
it was Raqqa and what else?
Firebase and Zygote.
Okay.
Zygote, however you pronounce it. The one, I'll start with the one I wasn't necessarily impressed with, and it was just the Firebase one.
Yeah.
It was honestly kind of boring, if I'm being, like, it was intriguing at the start.
Yes.
Now, I think the thing that kind of hurt the situation was I watched Raqqa before, which had like the narration, so like it kind of helped you know what was kind of going on, and this was the exact opposite, and so you're trying to figure out what's going on, and obviously they do some explanation during, but just wasn't my favorite. Like I love the idea of something like that, Vietnam, like old school military, in a different foreign land kind of thing, horror. I think that's a very cool concept, but it just didn't do it for me.
So one thing that I thought was really interesting that stood out with all of these, I guess you would call them like the more proper short films or whatever, is the extreme blend of sci-fi with the horror.
100%.
And so that was not a thing that I expected to be in all of these videos, but it really played a prominent part. And so, like with Firebase, it's taking place in Vietnam, like during the Vietnam War, but then you have this idea of like the relativity capsule suit that one of the guys is going to wear to counteract like the paranormal powers that the river god has and stuff. And so it's just this weird mix of like sort of technology, but also paranormal and conflict and violence.
Right.
And that's a thing where I don't really feel like we've seen a lot of outside of like Aliens 2 or Aliens. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, that's true. Yeah.
That's kind of more like where I see this one sitting in the larger, horror genre. But it also didn't, to your point, I think that they tried to do a lot of establishing backstory, but they did it so fast that you didn't really have time to like grow an attachment to the characters.
Yeah.
And so then it's like, okay, now it's finally set up for this final fight between two people that I don't really know that well.
Yeah. And then it was just, it was done. What can you do?
Yeah.
Now, I really liked the Raqqa.
I was amazed that they were able to get Sigourney Weaver.
Dude, they have, like, that
was legit, right?
When I was doing some research on them, I mean, they had Sigourney Weaver, they've had Carly Pope, Charlito Copley, Jason Cope. I mean, just like multiple. I mean, Dakota Fanning, she was in these. Jose Pablo. I mean, like, it is like super surprising, but yet again, Oscar nominated filmmaker.
Sure.
that probably helps a little bit. But yeah, I was super stoked when I saw her. I was like, are you kidding me? Like, how the hell? It also, the way it started though, it reminded me of the Terminator.
Yeah, definitely.
Like the second one for sure, like the beginning of it, like when they're kind of going through the, anyway. And also, like, that was the first one I watched. And so, like, and with the narration of the woman talking, and it's just like, this is definitely a lot like Terminator. So if there are robots in this, then we know for a fact that they ripped off Terminator, but it was the exact opposite. It was like this, reptile aliens coming down to, like, enslave, eat, and, like, I guess use us for breeding, use people for breeding, I guess.
Yeah, using the humans as incubators for the baby aliens, which was kind of a weird take. To me, it felt very much like Alien meets The Matrix.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. But it definitely like laid a good landscape of like a destitute. Is that a word?
Sure.
Land. So like just post-apocalyptic land. Mm-hmm. I thought they laid that out really well. And the other thought I was having was like, man, if like just the quality of it, like I was expecting some really bad quality, like just CGI, just all the above. And honestly, I wasn't that upset with it. Like I thought this had better graphics than for sure some of the movies we've seen in the past. The story overall, was interesting as well. And I think the only thing I thought was kind of confusing was like when I started it, I was watching on YouTube, and on YouTube, on like the bar that shows where it's at, like how far it's played, there's like little lines, like if you have kind of chapters, and I didn't realize that it had the lines initially, and so I moved my mouse and it said part 3, and I was like, are you kidding me? I have 2 other parts that I missed? Like, that ruins like everything. Well, no, it's just part 3 of the same film, so that kind of threw me off for a second. But I definitely wanted more at the end, too.
Yeah, so that was actually going to be my next question, was if you had watched all 3 parts, and it sounds like you did. And in Netflix, they had them all back-to-back as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's why I selected these 3, because they were the longest, and I was like, I knew that you were saying that they were, like, comprised of, like, pieces.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, that has to be it.
Yeah.
But they all say Volume 1 as well, which makes me think, like, oh, shoot, are they going to have, like, a volume... Like, how many volumes are we going to get of this? Because I think we should get I would watch Volume 2, even if it's a prequel, right.
Yeah, and I think Raqqa was the one that I was definitely most impressed with. I thought that, like you said, the visuals were surprisingly good for ambitious as they were. Because, I mean, they were relying a lot on CG, which normally, like, kills it for me. But the way that they did the filming around it definitely made it fit better for this than it does a lot of other times. Yeah,
you definitely knew you weren't watching Blockbuster, but it didn't get in the way so much that made me hate it,
Yeah, the only part, or the only element of it that I thought was not super strong was on part 2. I felt like it relied a lot more on the acting and like the characters interacting with each other, and it just wasn't as... Like, that I feel like is harder to cover up than not super realistic visuals, just because it's like, oh, come on now. But
like, I think, was it part 2 that had the guy who could build anything at a junkyard, and like, he just brought fire. Yeah, that I agree 100%. I was almost a little lost there, but because it was short, I was right back in it.
Yeah. So. Yeah, and then I guess the other one was Zygote. That's the other one you watched?
Yep. Yeah, the one with Dakota Fanning.
Yeah, I didn't even put together that's who that was.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So, yeah. That one I thought was really interesting conceptually. Yeah. It definitely left like a lot up to the imagination, but also did a good job of being scary. And that monster, the creature, was one of the creepier things I have ever seen in a movie. Yeah. I was really impressed with the creativity of that, and also how they pulled it off visually.
Yeah, this is a prime example of like where setting up the monster would have been incredibly helpful, or would have made it a little bit more intense. Normally, like, I don't like to see the monsters because my imagination's worse, but I felt like since
definitely.
But I agree with you on that. Like, I thought it was very unique monster that they had there, and with all the eyes and all the body parts and all that. And it's like, I just want to know about it now. Like, I hope that we do get a prequel out of it, because, the way this one starts is just the two of them talking, at whatever base that they're at.
Yeah.
And, it was just, you just, I get it. It's 22 minutes long, so they don't have a ton of time, to make this huge movie, but, this is definitely one I hope that we get a lot more from in the future.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a cool thing to key in on, is like, definitely with Zygote and Raqqa, at the end, we were both, I feel like, left wanting a lot more. Whereas a lot of times with horror movies that are too long, by the end you're just so ready for it to be over.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, I get it. Come on, let's get through this. And so I feel like it's almost easier to maintain that feeling of like urgency or discomfort or horror when you're working with a shorter period of time, because you can just go all out. And I feel like as an audience member, I can stay engaged in something that's like really intense and scary for 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. It's a lot harder to stay that same level of engaged for 2 hours.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so, absolutely.
But yeah, this one I thought was really good. It reminded me story-wise, just kind of in the things that they were alluding to about like stringing together organs from animals and then from miners or whatever. But there's a book called Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood that just a lot of things about this reminded me of. And that was a book that I found really, really fascinating and also really disturbing. So if anyone is looking for good sort of like sci-fi dystopian horror reading, mm-hmm. I would recommend that.
I like it. Overall, man, I was pretty stoked with this. Like, granted, not the biggest fan, but it doesn't mean that the second was, the Firebase was bad. But it was just compared to the others. But super, super stoked on it, just from like how it started to where it got to. It's on Netflix now. It should give, even with the Oscar award-winning director, it should still give like small-time people or people wanting to do their own thing that might be in like the Midwest, and it's like, how do you, mm-hmm. Try think about being from like Nebraska, thinking like, how do I get into film? Well, you can do it yourself. Like here's a prime example, with YouTube and Twitch, and you can go off of like Evil Dead stuff that they, there's a lot of options that you have there.
Well, and I had a really hard time finding much information about Oats Studios.
Yeah.
Once I saw it pop up on Netflix, I thought maybe that meant that it had become a lot more like well known, like there was more of like a groundswell around it or something. But the Wikipedia page is pretty bare, and there's just not really a ton out there that I could find. And a theory that I wanted to confirm was, as you go through the Netflix, I guess, like season, at the very end are some really rough, like CGI, like computer animated shorts.
Yeah. And
I thought the visuals on those were kind of terrible. But I also would assume that those were like very early on. And even at that, they did some really cool things that I've never seen in CGI before. Like, it was almost like they were treating it like they had a real camera that was moving around the scene just like you would with a real camera. Whereas I feel like a lot of times with CGI, you don't do that because you don't have a camera. You're just like designing on a screen.
Yeah.
And so there were some little, almost like, I guess you wouldn't say like filming techniques, but like animation techniques or something. Like the presentation of it was really creative and really interesting.
Yeah.
And so to see it go from just sort of that initial foray where it's like, well, I'm most limited right now by my computer animation aptitude or abilities, but I can still find some really creative and cool things to do and ways to tell like a compelling story, to now all of a sudden I've got this like super awesome looking, like very engaging, big special effects driven, visually pleasing short film with Sigourney Weaver in it, like that should be encouraging to anybody,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like to see like how this can happen over time and how you can progress and get better. And I think that, you know, getting stuff out there and having your artistic product end up in front of people is really satisfying, but it's also a really good way to get feedback quick. And it's cool that we're in a time where you can see like that happening with horror. You know, it's not like the only market for it is if you're doing something super poppy or something that you can sell to Hollywood. Like, no, there's plenty of ways to get out there and do your thing. So if you have a thing, get out there and do it.
Exactly. And to clarify real quick, Neil Blomkamp, who is the director, he's only Oscar nominated. I don't know if I said he was award winning. I think I did. He's just nominated. But he does specialize in trying to blend natural and photorealistic into computer generated effects, which goes right along lines with what you were talking about with the way he was trying to put the camera in with the CGI. But yeah, could not agree more, my man.
Well, that's about all I had on this one, but I really enjoyed going through it. And like I said, there is a collection on Netflix now. And so it'll have, like I said, with raqqa, like all 3 parts were just back to back. You didn't have to like click next or anything. And then they had several episodes of like Cooking with Bill, all just back to back in the Cooking with Bill episode. So it's kind of a quick way to go through the stuff fast. And you can always just skip to the next episode if you don't like the one you're watching. So anybody who hasn't checked out Oats Studios and has Netflix and likes horror should probably do so. And that's it for today's episode. If you've listened this far, then thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We're always looking for new ideas, so if you have any questions, comments, or movie suggestions, please send us an email at thehorrificpod@gmail.com, or feel free to comment on or message our Facebook page. Just search for The Horrific Podcast. Thanks for listening.